That evening had the strange kind of stillness that always seemed to settle over the house before a southern thunderstorm, when the wind outside stops teasing the curtains, when even the leaves on the porch plants hold their breath, and when the air gets heavy with something more than just humidity, something like a pause that stretches too long between words in a conversation you don't want to finish. And I remember exactly where I was sitting on the couch, barefoot, with a throw blanket tucked over my legs and a half-empty glass of cranberry ginger ale sweating on the side table, while Sean was sprawled at the other end, tapping his phone. Like he was bored, but glancing at me every few seconds like he was waiting for a signal I hadn't decided to send. Robert's face was on the tablet screen propped up against a cushion, and he looked tired in that particular way men do when they want credit for how hard they're working but don't want to say it out loud, with his collar open, his hair flat from the hard hat, and his voice cutting in and out because the oil field network couldn't hold a video call for longer than 6 minutes without crackling like an old walkie-talkie. And right as he was about to make some joke about the weather and whether Sean had finished painting the garage trim like he'd asked, the screen froze on his mid-blink expression and then turned solid black without warning, leaving nothing but silence and the reflection of my own face staring back from the glass. I didn't say anything right away because I knew he wouldn't call back until the signal came back up and because part of me didn't want the call to reconnect, not out of resentment or fatigue, but because in that moment, there was a softness in the room that didn't belong to work trips or Wi-Fi signals or even the script of marriage that had become so practiced I could recite it in my sleep. And as I reached to turn off the screen and rest the tablet on the coffee table, I felt the air shift just slightly beside me. And Sean sat up straighter, shifting his weight like someone preparing to say something, but waiting for a cue they weren't sure would come. He didn't look at me right away, just stared ahead at the paused frame of the movie we'd been pretending to watch, some mid-tier drama with actors we both forgot the names of, and then without warning, he leaned toward me just a little, letting his shoulder brush mine, and said with a voice so even it caught me off guard, "We can just wait for the storm to pass. Or talk." And when I didn't answer immediately, he turned his head slightly, just enough to let me see the reflection of the kitchen light in his eyes, and I nodded, not because I had something to say, but because something in me was too still to resist movement. He didn't wait for further permission, and without another word he shifted closer, slow and certain, until I felt the weight of his head settle gently onto my shoulder, not demanding anything, not searching for reaction, just resting like he belonged there. And I could feel the warmth of his temple through the soft fabric of my sweatshirt and the rhythm of his breathing as it synced quietly with mine. And I didn't move, not even an inch, because in that instant, the silence stopped being awkward and started feeling necessary. Outside, a flash of lightning lit up the windows in a single pulse, bright enough to throw shadows across the floor, and in the space between the light and the thunder that followed, the electricity snapped off with a quiet pop, throwing the whole house into darkness. And neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. We just sat there in the thick quiet, with the soft ticking of the cooling lamp bulb and the distant creak of the roof beams adjusting to the sudden drop in pressure, and I became acutely aware of how close his breath was to the hollow at the base of my throat. He spoke then, low and warm, his voice closer than I expected, his words quiet like he was telling me a secret meant only for my skin to hear. "You smell like apples," and something calm. And I didn't answer, couldn't answer, because my hand had already lifted without my permission, fingers brushing gently through his hair like it was instinct and not choice, like I'd done it before in another lifetime. And he didn't pull away, just breathed a little deeper, a little slower, and I felt it, every rise and fall of his chest against my side. He shifted slightly, not enough to change the shape of the moment, but just enough that his breath warmed the side of my neck. And then he whispered again, softer this time, almost like a reassurance meant more for himself than for me. "Don't be scared." And as my fingers paused in his hair, I felt his hand find mine in the dark, not grabbing or holding, but simply resting against it, skin to skin, pulse to pulse, and for a long moment that stretched longer than it had any right to. We stayed that way, suspended in a kind of quiet that didn't feel like silence at all. I didn't flinch, I didn't pull back, I didn't even breathe too deeply, because something about the darkness gave us both permission not to explain ourselves. And something about the thunder outside made everything feel slower, heavier, as if time itself had curled up around us and decided to wait for morning. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the first thing I saw was the soft bend of my shoulder where his head had rested, and for a heartbeat I waited to feel that familiar weight again, that quiet stillness that had settled between us like a breath held too long. But there was nothing, only the curve of the blanket where my arm had fallen in sleep, only the vague imprint of memory clinging to skin that had cooled, without warning, and my hand, without meaning to, lifted toward the empty space as if it still belonged to someone who had forgotten to say goodbye. I sat up slowly, not out of reluctance, but because something in my chest felt unsteady, as though movement might shake loose the shape of what had happened, and I stared at the wall across from the bed, the one that held the framed photograph of Robert and me in Charleston last fall, with the golden marshes behind us and the light catching just enough of our faces to make it look like love, though I remembered now that we'd been arguing about the hotel bill that morning and only smiled for the camera because a stranger had asked us to. Pulling on the soft robe that still smelled faintly of lavender and dryer sheets, I padded down the hallway toward the kitchen, passing the closed guest room door without pause, knowing that whatever had passed in the darkness had not followed either of us into the daylight. At least not in the way people mean when they talk about choices and regrets and the point where lines start to blur. And when I turned the corner into the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee hit me first, followed by the low hum of the dishwasher and the clink of spoon against ceramic. Robert was standing at the counter, dressed in his usual travel wrinkled button-down and jeans, rolling the sleeves up with that distracted efficiency that always made it look like he was preparing for a task he didn't particularly care for. And when he looked up, there was no accusation in his expression, only a kind of resigned calm that told me he had arrived hours ago, maybe even long enough to know where everything had been left unsaid. "You're up," he said, lifting his mug to his lips with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I nodded, pulling my robe tighter with a chill that didn't come from the room. "I didn't expect you until tomorrow night," I replied, crossing to the fridge, not because I needed anything but because I needed to open something, to hold something cold and solid in my hands while the rest of the morning settled into place. He shrugged, placing the mug down with a soft clink. "Got an earlier flight. Weather said the storm would slow down travel, so I figured I'd beat it. Looks like I was right." He glanced toward the back door where the trees outside still swayed gently in the remnants of last night's wind. "He didn't give you any trouble, did he?" he asked, the corners of his mouth twitching upward like the question was more of a joke than a suspicion. I smiled, not out of comfort, but because I knew it was the right answer to give. "On the contrary, very well behaved," I said, and before I could explain or soften the pause that followed, another presence entered the room with the kind of timing that only seems natural when it shouldn't be. Sean walked in from the hallway, barefoot and bare-chested, his gray athletic shorts riding low on his hips, his damp hair pushed back from his face like he'd just stepped out of a shower, or maybe like he hadn't slept at all. And when he saw Robert standing there, he didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't offer any apology for the casualness of his entrance. "Morning," he said, stretching one arm over his head and then rubbing the back of his neck like someone just waking from a long nap. "You're back early." Robert nodded. "Just walked in not too long ago. Guess you survived the storm without me." Sean grinned, opening the fridge like it was his own. "Barely," he said, pulling out a bottle of orange juice and unscrewing the cap one-handed. "She's been using me as her culinary guinea pig all week. I'm on breakfast number 3 already." Robert chuckled and gave me a sidelong glance. "She does that when she's restless," he said. "Gets dangerous around the kitchen." Sean leaned back against the counter, taking a swig from the bottle and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand in a way that looked too easy, too familiar. "Yeah, well, if that's what restlessness tastes like, I say let her stay restless." I busied myself with nothing, fidgeting with a spoon, refolding a towel, refilling a half-empty mug, anything that kept my hands from being still, anything that kept me from looking too long in either direction. Outside, the wind had quieted, the storm had passed, but I knew then, in the soft quiet of that morning, that storms don't always leave damage you can see right away. Some settle in the silence, waiting. Some move inside you, waiting. And some never really leave at all. The morning had that rare kind of stillness where even the birds seemed hesitant to sing, and as I stepped barefoot into the garden with a pair of worn gloves and an old trowel in hand, I could feel the dampness of last night's storm clinging to the grass and to the back of my neck, where the breeze brushed past with just enough weight to remind me that the silence inside the house had followed me out here, and that no matter how many leaves I cleared or how many roots I dug through, I wouldn't be able to uproot the memory of the way he breathed against my skin in the dark without ever asking permission. Sean was already in the yard by the time I arrived, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, a smudge of soil streaking across his left forearm, and he moved with the kind of easy, quiet confidence that made it impossible not to notice the way his body navigated space like he'd studied how to leave. The right amount of air between himself and everything he wasn't quite allowed to touch. And I kept my distance at first, pretending to focus on the hydrangeas, until I saw him reach for the heavy wooden crate by the tool shed, the one filled with damp soil and cracked clay pots. And as he lifted it in one clean motion, his grip shifted slightly, and I watched his hand slip, watched the sudden lurch forward, and before I could react, he caught himself by bracing one hand directly against my shoulder. There was nothing inappropriate about the way he touched me, Nothing deliberate or invasive or lingering in the technical sense, but the heat of his palm through the thin cotton of my shirt sent a jolt up my spine that I wasn't prepared for. And though he pulled back instantly, apologizing with that sheepish half-smile he always used when pretending things didn't matter, I stood still for a moment longer than I should have, not because I was startled, but because the exact place where his fingers had landed now burned like a branded memory I couldn't wash away with morning sunlight or garden sweat. We didn't speak about it. Not then, and not after he walked off toward the compost pile with the crate now steadied in his arms like it weighed nothing at all. But the space between us shifted subtly, and every time I moved past him or bent down to gather loose branches, I was aware of the nearness, of the way his presence had started to echo louder than the actual sounds he made. And by the time afternoon gave way to the golden hush of early evening, I was already rehearsing small talk for dinner that felt more like an alibi than a meal. Marta arrived just after 7 with her usual laugh and the kind of floral scarf that made her look like someone who always had a glass of wine waiting in hand. And she hugged me tightly at the door before glancing into the house like she expected to catch a glimpse of some hidden mischief. But when we stood alone in the kitchen, while Sean finished setting the table out on the patio, she leaned a little, too close, lowered her voice the way old friends do when they've seen something they're not supposed to comment on, and said, "Your nephew looks at you like you're the beginning of a story he wasn't supposed to start." And though I laughed like she'd said something ridiculous, my hand trembled as I poured the wine. I told her she was imagining things, that he just didn't know how to look away from anything he was focused on, and I waved it off with a joke about how young men raised in digital cages always stare too long in real life. But the bottle slipped slightly in my hand, and a splash of wine hit the counter before I could steady it, and as I reached for the paper towels, I realized my fingers were cold despite the heat of the kitchen, and my pulse had jumped into my throat like it had something to confess before I could shut it down. Dinner passed in polite conversation and shared stories that tasted like they belonged to someone else's life, but each time I looked up from my plate, I caught Sean's eyes already on mine, not in a confrontational way or even a flirtatious one, but with the same quiet intensity as the night before, like he was trying to measure whether anything had changed in the way I held my fork, or tilted my head, or laughed a little too hard at Marta's stories. And I hated how much I noticed that I liked being seen by someone who didn't have a checklist in his mind when he looked at me. Later, after the dishes had been rinsed and Marta had driven off into the dark with a wave and a wink that lingered longer than her perfume, I returned to the living room to find Sean sitting cross-legged on the floor near the window with his guitar in his lap, tuning it with the same patience I remembered from the first month he moved in, and when he looked up and said nothing but patted the rug beside him, I sat without thinking, already knowing that this wasn't about music, but about whatever came next when silence stops being safe. He positioned the guitar between us and guided my hands over the strings, his arms folding around mine like a second skin, not urgent, but certain, and his breath landed softly against my cheek as he whispered, "Feel it. Don't think." And as my fingers fumbled over the frets and the chord finally rang clear, the back of my neck touched his lips. Not a kiss, not yet, but enough to make me stop breathing long enough for him to murmur, "You're warm. You're not someone's wife right now. You're just alive." I didn't move right away because the words he had just spoken hadn't fully landed in the part of my mind where logic still tried to keep order, and the way his voice had sounded, low and steady and so close to my ear that I could feel it in my throat, had bypassed every filter I'd built for myself over the years, every practiced boundary I thought I had reinforced with polite smiles and harmless jokes. And now, here I was sitting between his legs with a guitar resting across both our laps, and the scent of his skin pressed quietly into the back of my hair, like it had been there before and simply returned without asking. I told myself I needed to get up, not because I was afraid, but because I had nothing left to say that would make what just happened untrue. And when I rose abruptly, pushing the guitar forward so that it fell into his hands, the sound it made wasn't loud, but it felt final, and I turned away from him so that he wouldn't see the color in my cheeks or the breath I held just a moment too long before speaking. And when I finally managed the words, "Go to sleep," my voice cracked in the middle like an old record skipping, not from anger but from something softer that scared me more than fury ever could. He didn't argue and he didn't move, not at first, just sat there on the floor with his palms resting flat against the wood and his gaze burning a path into the middle of my spine as though he knew I wasn't angry and wasn't confused but simply overwhelmed by the quiet realization that something had shifted beyond what either of us could reverse with space or time or well-behaved silence. And then, when I finally turned to walk toward the stairs, he said behind me in a tone that sounded almost amused but not unkind, "Say that again, but without the shake in your voice." And I didn't respond, because I didn't trust what my mouth might let slip. That night, I stood in the bathroom for 20 minutes brushing my hair with more force than necessary and avoiding my own reflection in the mirror because I didn't want to see what might already be showing in my eyes. And when I finally climbed into bed, I kept the lamp on and opened a book I didn't read just so I wouldn't have to hear the sound of the house adjusting to the weight of a silence we had both helped create. And I pulled the blanket up to my shoulders as though it could keep the rest of the night from finding me too exposed. I woke around 2 in the morning not because of a sound but because of an absence. And when I padded downstairs in my robe and, bare feet, not even sure what I was expecting to find, I saw a folded piece of paper left neatly beside the kettle, with my name written across the front in Sean's messy print, like it had been scrawled quickly but with intention, and I hesitated for a full minute before touching it, not because I feared what was inside, but because I already knew it would be something I wouldn't forget, even if I burned it the moment after reading. The note was short, written in black ink that smudged slightly where his thumb must have brushed the edge, and the words were neither poetic nor dramatic, but landed inside my chest with the quiet force of something that had been building for longer than I'd let myself admit. Your blanket smells like you. I can't sleep under it anymore without thinking too much. I'm sorry. I stood there in the kitchen with the note pressed between my palms like something sacred and guilty all at once, and the weight of what it meant was heavier than I expected. Not because of what it confessed, but because of how simply it told the truth, and instead of tearing it or throwing it away or even folding it carefully into something I could hide in a drawer, I walked across the tile floor to the bread box, opened the lid slowly, and placed it inside like it belonged among things that were meant to stay warm and untouched. The sky outside the kitchen window had already begun to pale slightly with the first hints of morning, not yet full light but no longer night, and I stood there holding a glass of water I didn't need to drink, staring into the backyard that now looked like any other suburban space but felt like the site of a quiet collision, and my fingers curled tighter around the glass with a pressure that surprised me, because the shape of it in my hand reminded me too much of a touch that didn't belong to me but now lived somewhere under my skin anyway. I wasn't crying and I wasn't smiling and I wasn't regretting anything. But my body felt like it had stepped into a version of my life where the smallest details had become louder than all the conversations I'd had in the last year, and the pulse in my wrist beat like a whisper I couldn't ignore. Somewhere upstairs, I imagined him turning over in bed, maybe wide awake and staring at the ceiling, maybe sleeping without dreams, but I didn't go back up to find out. I stayed there at the counter, holding that glass like it might suddenly tell me how to be still, again. The morning light came in soft through the kitchen windows, filtered by the old lace curtains I kept meaning to replace, but somehow that gentle floral pattern diffusing the sun had always made the house feel less like a structure and more like a breath I could still hold on to. And as I stood by the stove waiting for the kettle to whistle, I heard Robert's footsteps, coming down the stairs, even and familiar, the sound of a man who packed the same way every week and who spoke in quick lists when he had one foot already out the door. He didn't linger over breakfast and didn't ask questions about my plans. For the next 2 days, just kissed the top of my head as if that gesture alone could count for presence. And with one last zip of his bag and the mechanical click of the suitcase handle locking into place, he was gone. The door clicking closed behind him with the kind of finality that only felt temporary when I let myself pretend distance was always just a matter of miles and not momentum. I turned around then, half expecting to find the kitchen empty. But there was Sean leaning against the pantry with one hand curled around a mug and the other shoved into the pocket of those sweatpants he seemed to live in, the same ones I had folded last week without, asking, and his eyes were already on me, not wide or startled, but narrowed slightly in that way that made it feel like he was reading something written just beneath my skin. He took a slow sip from his mug, then tilted it slightly in my direction like it was part of the conversation, and said through a low breath of steam, "You look different this morning." And though I opened my mouth to respond with something vague or harmless, the only words that came out were, "I'm tired," because there was no room left between us for pretending that sleep had been anything but a performance the night before. He didn't nod or shift or break eye contact, just set the mug on the counter with that soft clink that felt louder than it should have, then walked past me toward the sink without brushing my shoulder, which somehow felt more intentional than if he had, and just as he passed, he lowered his voice to a near whisper, the kind that grazed the edge of my hearing, and curled into the back of my neck and said, "You've got a pillow mark under your left eye. Only the left. I watched it while you were sleeping." I didn't reply and didn't look at him, just gripped the kettle with both hands like the heat would ground me, because there was something about that confession, not the words themselves, but the quiet certainty with which he said them, that made me feel like my body had already betrayed me long before I gave it permission to want anything. We spent the morning doing things that gave our hands purpose without giving our minds permission to wander, And when we ended up in the garden again, moving planters and clearing debris left by the wind, the air felt warmer than the forecast had predicted. Or maybe it was just that the distance between us kept shrinking with every task we pretended was routine. And when I bent to lift the edge of a heavy ceramic pot and my foot slipped slightly in the soft soil, I didn't fall far because his arms were already there, steady and strong around my waist, catching me in one motion that felt less like rescue and more like recognition. We stood there longer than we should have, my hands braced against his chest, his breath shallow but not unsteady, and the muscles in his arms tightening just enough to make it clear he wasn't ready to let go. And when I looked up at him, there was something in his eyes that made my throat tighten because it wasn't lust or confusion or even desperation, but something softer and more dangerous, something that knew me too well to pretend. He leaned in then, not sudden or forceful, but with a deliberate slowness that gave me every chance to step away, and brought his forehead to mine like we were sharing something holy, something we'd built quietly out of silence and glances, and everything we hadn't said. And then he asked in the lowest voice I had ever heard him use, "Do you want me to kiss you?" And I answered with the only word I could find that didn't lie. No, but I didn't move. He kissed me once with a gentleness that asked for understanding more than permission, and when he kissed me again, it was slower but fuller, as if we were both admitting to something we could no longer hide, with his hands on my face and the closeness between us making words unnecessary, in a way that made my knees soften and my heart stutter, because this time there was no hesitation, no retreat, only the kind of intensity that doesn't ask for permission because it already knows it's been given. When we finally pulled apart, I didn't speak for a long moment, not because I didn't have words, but because none of them felt real compared to what had just happened, and my hands were trembling slightly as I reached for the edge of the planter again to steady myself, and I said in a voice I barely recognized as my own, "This will be the beginning of the end," and he looked at me without fear and replied, "Do you want the end?" And when I said, "No," it was the most honest thing I'd said in months, and when I added, "But I want you," it was the first time I let myself believe it wasn't wrong to feel alive. That night I went to bed without brushing my hair, without changing into anything but the same old cotton shirt I'd worn since noon, and without the quiet rituals I usually relied on to settle my mind, because the truth was, I didn't want to settle anything, didn't want to smother the weight of what had happened with lavender lotion or silence or the pretense of sleep, and so I lay under the blanket with my body stiff and my thoughts louder than the wind outside the windows, eyes open to the dimness of the room until the shadows themselves began to shift like they were breathing. I heard the creak of the hallway floorboards before I saw him, because this house, like most honest places, reveals everything if you listen closely, and I didn't turn my head or speak when the door eased open slowly, as if he expected me to be asleep and was already preparing himself for disappointment or retreat. But when he stepped inside and closed it behind him with a soft click, I felt the air change, felt the exact moment the room recognized him and held its breath with me. He didn't crawl into bed or reach for me or ask permission, and he didn't carry the weight of someone demanding a response, but instead lowered himself slowly onto the floor beside my bed, folding his long frame with a kind of quiet reverence that made it feel less like an intrusion and more like a confession. And when he rested his back against the nightstand and drew his knees up, I turned toward him before I could think better of it and found his eyes already waiting for mine. For a long time we didn't speak, just breathed the same air in a silence that was no longer empty but full of every word we couldn't say without changing everything. And finally he reached one hand toward the edge of the bed, not grabbing, not pleading, just placing it there, palm up, as if he were offering something that could still be refused. And I let my fingers slide into his before my mind could catch up to what my body had already decided. "I couldn't sleep," he said after a while, his voice low and steady, the kind of tone people use when they're scared of waking something fragile. "Not without you." And he didn't mean it romantically or dramatically, didn't lace it with any weight that didn't already belong to it. He just said it like it was a fact that explained everything. And I didn't answer because nothing I could have said would have mattered more than the truth already wrapped around our joined hands. He stayed like that for a long time, barely moving, only shifting occasionally when the hardwood floor pressed too hard against some part of him, and I felt his thumb trace a slow circle across the inside of my palm, not to comfort me, but to remind us both that we were still here, still inside the same moment we had created earlier in the garden and never truly left. And eventually my eyes closed, not because I was tired, but because I had finally stopped resisting what was already happening inside me. When I woke the next morning, the sun was rising through the sheer curtains, and the bed beside me was still empty. But I could hear faint movement from the kitchen, and the scent of coffee was already threading its way down the hall. And I sat up slowly, brushing the sleep from my eyes and the tangled mess of my hair into something passable, then made my way, down the stairs barefoot with a kind of hesitation that didn't come from doubt, but from anticipation. He was sitting at the kitchen table with one leg tucked under him, scrolling through his phone with the kind of absent focus people have when they're waiting for a sound more than a message. And when he looked up and saw me, he didn't smile wide or speak quickly, just gave me that slow, easy grin that barely lifted one side of his mouth but always managed to land directly in the center of my chest. And then he winked. It wasn't flirtatious and it wasn't smug. It was just a gesture that said we shared something neither of us had planned, but both of us had chosen the moment we stopped pretending. And as I walked past him to the coffee pot, he didn't say anything, just let his fingers trail briefly across the small of my back with that same pressure he'd used in the garden, the kind that lingered longer than contact should. I poured myself a cup in silence, leaned against the counter, like nothing in the world had changed. And as I took the first sip, I saw it, the faint mark just below my hairline. Not bold, not obvious, but there all the same. The echo of his lips from the second kiss he gave me when neither of us wanted to forget. And I didn't reach up to cover it or wipe it away because somehow knowing it was there made me feel like I hadn't imagined anything. Robert would be back tomorrow, and the world would likely return to its old routine with the exact cruelty that routine always brings. But in that moment, standing there in a borrowed silence and sunlight, I understood that something had been set in motion, not with a plan or a promise, but with a look, a touch, and a kiss that had broken more than just rules. It had broken the stillness I'd lived in for years, and no one had seen it. Not yet. The scent of vanilla always lingered in the house longer than anything I cooked or cleaned or tried to erase, and I knew it had become part of me in ways I couldn't control. Because even now, as I stood by the window waiting for her car to pull into the driveway, I caught it rising from the fabric of my sleeve, sweet and warm and almost deceptive, like the kind of memory that wears perfume and smiles politely while opening old wounds. And when she finally stepped out of her silver SUV with that carefully pressed blouse and her signature too bright lipstick, I felt my stomach tighten before she even opened her arms. She hugged me tightly, as always, but her embrace was more posture than warmth, more habit than heart, and I could already feel the scrutiny in the way she stepped back and looked at me like I was a recipe gone slightly wrong, not ruined but lacking balance. And the first thing she asked wasn't about my health or my happiness, but where Sean was, because her tone had that edge she saved for unfinished business. And I pointed vaguely toward the back of the house, knowing full well he had seen her car through the upstairs window and was probably calculating how many words he could say to her today without losing control. When he finally emerged, it was without announcement and without a smile, his posture rigid and his eyes distant, and he didn't walk toward her so much as allow himself to be in the same space, and she smiled too brightly and reached out too confidently, and when he didn't take her hand, she dropped it with the grace of someone trained to recover from emotional fumbles without showing bruises, and asked how he'd been, to which he responded in a voice stripped of warmth or welcome. "I've been exactly where you sent me. Like luggage." And the silence that followed was thick enough to spread between every surface in the room. She blinked, said something about choices and responsibilities and how she'd done her best. But he didn't stay to hear the rest, just walked past her toward the hallway, with that deliberate stillness he used when he was trying not to slam doors or say things he would later regret. And when she turned back toward me, I could see the calculation begin behind her eyes. The slow unraveling of concern into suspicion, though she masked it under a smile and a tilt of the head and said, "You look different. Are you sleeping?" And I laughed too fast and said, "Just busy. Lots of things to handle," while my hands fidgeted with the edge of a dish towel like it could anchor me to some version of the truth. She watched me for a moment too long, then nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, and I knew she was filing away every hesitation, every glance, every breath I took while I avoided her eyes. And when Sean passed through the kitchen again 10 minutes later with a glass of water and a purposefully casual stride, he let his hand graze my shoulder as he moved past, not long enough to be noticed by someone who wasn't paying attention, but just long enough to send a current through my chest that made my pupils widen and my spine straighten. And I knew immediately she had seen it because she paused mid-sentence and looked directly at me, not startled but measuring, as if trying to calculate whether what she had just witnessed had been real or imagined. But she didn't say anything. She just tucked her hair behind her ear and changed the subject to something shallow and domestic. And I played along with the performance, offering small talk and snacks, and asking about the weather back home, as if I didn't feel her gaze tracking every move I made. And by the time she finally left just before dinner, the weight in my chest hadn't lessened. It had only shifted deeper. And I stood by the door for a long minute after it closed behind her, breathing in the ghost of her perfume like it had returned to remind me that not all visitors leave when the car drives away. That night, the air in the living room was thick with everything we hadn't said while she was here. And when I walked in and saw Sean by the window, backlit by the last trace of golden light and holding the same glass of water he'd had earlier, I felt something inside me tighten and rise all at once, and I said without preamble, "You're leaving tomorrow. It's time. This has to stop." Because it was the only line I hadn't crossed yet, and I was trying to remind myself where it still stood. He turned to face me slowly, with none of the defensiveness I expected and all of the certainty I feared, and he took 2 steps forward until the distance between us felt like a breath and not a boundary, and he said in that same steady voice he used when he wanted the truth to land soft but stay permanent, "Say that again. When my hands are on your waist." And then he reached for me like he'd done it 1,000 times in a dream and was finally giving himself permission to make it real. His hands found my waist with a calmness that made me forget how much I had rehearsed resistance, not because he was gentle, but because there was no hesitation, no second-guessing, only the steady certainty of someone who had stopped asking for permission and had started acting like we had already passed every point of return. And I felt the heat of his palms through the soft cotton of my shirt, like a slow ignition that didn't start with the skin, but with the way my body leaned into him instead of away, as if my own balance had quietly chosen him without bothering to inform my voice. I could have turned away then, could have raised my hand or stepped back or said his name like a warning, but instead I stood still while my fingers closed around the fabric of his shirt, wrinkling it between my fists like an anchor, and I tilted my chin upward just slightly, not to invite what came next, but to admit that it had already happened long before this moment ever asked for it out loud. And when his mouth found mine, the kiss didn't feel rushed or stolen or forbidden. It felt earned and slow and dangerously quiet, like the kind of storm that builds heat for days before breaking. There was no rush in how he kissed me again, no hunger that begged for urgency, only the weight of everything we had been carrying pressing into our mouths, into the movement of his lips and the way he breathed my name like it wasn't just a sound but a vow. And when his hand slid up my back with a tenderness that felt nothing like sin, I felt something in me surrender that I hadn't realized was still fighting, and I placed my hands on his shoulders, not to hold on, but to steady myself as the truth settled in. That this moment had never been a misstep, only the end of pretending. He whispered between kisses that he wasn't my nephew now, wasn't here to be polite or to wait for the polite version of me, that he was a man standing in front of a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted without conditions. And I felt his breath warm against my jaw as he said he saw me, not the version I packaged for the world, but the one who stopped breathing when he entered a room, the one who turned away too fast when his eyes lingered too long, and in that moment I no longer knew how to separate the lines I had drawn from the ones he had already crossed. We didn't go upstairs and we didn't turn off the lights. We stayed right there in the living room where the silence was no longer empty, but full of pulse and skin and everything unsaid. And when we ended up on the couch in a quiet, shared stillness, where he held me close and let his arm curve protectively around my shoulder as if to shield the silence we had both created like it belonged there, stroking my hair slowly with one hand while the other rested along the curve of my waist, and the way he held me wasn't possessive or urgent. It was still and quiet like someone memorizing peace before it gets taken. I said out loud, not meaning to, not rehearsed, not even certain where the words were coming from. "I want to stay here." And when he didn't answer, I clarified with a voice that shook but didn't break. "Not in the house. I want to stay in this moment. I want it to last longer than the guilt will." And he didn't speak, only nodded slowly against my temple, like he knew we were both already counting the minutes we didn't have. Hours later, after we'd drifted into that place between sleep and breathing, the door opened without warning. No keys, no knock, no echo of tires on gravel, only the quiet click of a man returning home earlier than he was supposed to. And I didn't hear it at first, but I felt Sean go completely still beneath me, and I turned my head just enough to catch the creak of floorboards outside the living room, slow and steady, each footstep pulling us both closer to the edge of something that couldn't be undone. The air changed the way it does before something shatters, and in that stillness I could hear everything. Robert's breath as he stood just outside the doorway, the way the wood under his heel didn't move again for a full 5 seconds, and the way my own heart pounded in my throat so loudly I thought it might speak before I did, but I didn't move, didn't cover myself, didn't reach for anything, because there was nothing left to pretend anymore. The door opened. He didn't burst in, and he didn't yell, didn't ask questions or shout names or demand explanations. He just stood there in the doorway with his hands still at his sides, eyes locked on mine first, then drifting slowly to Sean, whose bare chest was rising and falling in shallow waves beneath me, and then to the shirt I was wearing, the same one he had packed 3 days earlier when he thought he'd be gone long enough to miss me properly. Robert didn't speak. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He turned around and walked away with the kind of calm that doesn't come from forgiveness, but from something colder, and I didn't call after him, didn't chase, didn't cry. I just sat there with my body still wrapped around another man's warmth, knowing that the door he had just closed would sound different if it ever opened again. And even through the weight of silence, the scent of vanilla remained. His hands didn't just rest on my waist, they claimed it with a calm and deliberate pressure that didn't ask for response, but instead assumed a truth already shared, and as his fingers molded to the shape of my body through the thin fabric of my blouse, I felt the quiet unraveling of every justification I had built to keep myself still. Because the warmth of his touch didn't feel like temptation or danger or recklessness, but rather like the steady presence of something I had denied myself, long before he ever walked back into this house. I held on to his shirt, not because I needed balance, but because I didn't want to give myself the space to pull away. And as the fabric bunched under my grip, soft from washing and warm from his skin, I tilted my head just slightly, not in surrender, but in silent agreement. And the moment our mouths met, everything in my body stopped resisting because the kiss wasn't rough or impulsive or rushed. It was slow and deep and precise, like he was tasting a secret I had been hiding under politeness and self-control. And when he kissed me again, fuller and longer, I felt my heart stumble into rhythm with his, not out of romance or fantasy, but because it had nowhere else to go. His breath was warm and slow against my cheek as he whispered with a kind of honesty I had never been offered in any of my years with Robert, telling me that in this moment, he wasn't a boy or a guest or a name on a family tree, but a man who had watched me walk through this house like a ghost for too long, and who had waited not for permission, but for truth. And as he looked at me, not with hesitation but with clarity, and when he leaned closer again, it wasn't with desire, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew we had already crossed into something irreversible. I felt myself kiss him back not with hesitation, but with the weight of everything I had been afraid to feel. We didn't talk when we collapsed onto the couch in the thick silence of a house too familiar with denial, and as he kept one arm around me while the other rested lightly across my back, not with possession but with a kind of peace that made me forget everything outside that room. His fingers gentle but unflinching. I leaned into him with the kind of exhale that belongs only to the moments between guilt and clarity. And when his hand slid up to cradle the back of my head, stroking my hair with a slow rhythm that felt more like a vow than a comfort, I closed my eyes and said the words I hadn't planned to say aloud. I want to stay here, not meaning the house or the room or even the couch, but this version of time where I wasn't someone's obligation or someone's disappointment, but a body held because it was finally allowed to want something. He didn't answer immediately, and he didn't shift or let me go, just pulled me. The silence that hung in the house that morning wasn't peaceful or natural or even suspicious in the ordinary way. It was the kind of silence that came after something had already happened, after the noise had played out and the echo had faded. The kind of silence that didn't just fill the space but hollowed it out. And as I stepped barefoot into the kitchen, expecting at least the hum of the refrigerator or the clatter of a mug being set down, I found nothing but stillness and a folded piece of paper leaning against the coffee pot like a substitute for presence, like a resignation letter from a life he no longer wanted to report for. I didn't need to open the note to understand the tone it would carry because the handwriting alone, sharp and deliberate and overly neat, told me that he had written it slowly and with control, the way Robert did everything when he was trying not to let emotion ruin his dignity. But I read it anyway because not reading it felt like cowardice, and the words, "I was a husband. Now I am only a witness," landed not like a blow, but like a door closing softly behind someone you forgot to say goodbye to. And for a moment, I stood there gripping the edge of the counter with one hand, feeling the wood press into my palm, until I could almost pretend the pain was more real than the words. I ran through the house without thinking, checking the driveway, and then the side gate, and then the path that led down the hill, because some part of me still believed that if I caught him in time, if I said the right thing with the right tremble in my voice, maybe he would still come back, not out of forgiveness, but out of habit or inertia, or just the refusal to let someone else finish the story he had started. And when I finally caught sight of him walking toward the back fence with his bag over one shoulder and his shoulders pulled tight like they were bracing for wind, I called his name loud enough to tear something in my throat. He didn't turn around right away, and when he finally did, it wasn't with surprise or anger or confusion, but with the kind of flat expression people wear when they've already rehearsed what they're going to say and are only waiting for the audience to arrive. And when I reached him, breathless and cold and already preparing apologies that had no shape yet, he looked at me. Not like a man looks at his wife or even at a stranger, but like a man looks at a painting he used to admire but can no longer see clearly. "You could have chosen to be lonely," he said without raising his voice or stepping back. "You could have been honest about the emptiness and the silence and the fact that I wasn't enough anymore. But instead, you chose to be deceitful, to turn our life into a performance and make me the last person to find out that the audience had already changed. I opened my mouth to answer, to defend, to explain, but the words wouldn't form because nothing I could offer would unmake the reality that was now standing between us. And before I could reach for him or even touch his arm, Sean's voice came from behind us. Not loud, but certain. Not impulsive, but grounded. And when he said, "I love her," it didn't sound like a claim or a challenge. It sounded like a simple fact spoken too late. Robert turned then, finally letting his eyes settle on Sean with a kind of tiredness that made me feel older just by watching, and he said with no hesitation, "You may love her, but I lived with her. I built my days around her. I sat across from her every night, while she slowly disappeared into herself, and loving someone is not the same thing as knowing who they are when no one is watching." There was nothing more to say after that, no counter-argument or plea that would shift what had been solidified by that one sentence, and when I looked between the two of them, I felt like a person standing at the center of a road that had been split by an earthquake, no longer whole but too proud to admit I had been the fault line. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I didn't need to look to know it was her. My sister, his mother, the one who had left and returned and watched us all unravel, because she had sensed something the day she was here, and when I answered, she didn't ask how I was or if I was alone. She went straight to the question that made my knees soften. "What did you do?" she said with breath tight and words sharp. "Sean just told me he's staying, that he's not coming back, that this is where he's supposed to be. Is that true?" I pressed the phone to my ear so tightly it hurt, not because I wanted to hear her voice, but because I needed something to anchor me, something to stop the spinning that had started somewhere deep in my chest, and for the first time in my life, I had no answer, no words, no story to control the way the world saw me, and I stood there in the middle of the garden path with my mouth open and nothing coming out, and that silence, my own silence, scared me more than any threat she could have made. I stood frozen in the middle of the garden path, with the phone still pressed to my ear, and my sister's question repeating itself like a low warning in the back of my mind. But no matter how, many times I opened my mouth or tried to clear my throat or search for the usual way out through some clever excuse or partial truth. There were no words waiting behind my teeth because something had finally broken in me. Not a crack that could be plastered over, but a rupture, quiet and full and complete. Like a dam giving way not to violence but to the slow and unstoppable release of everything I had tried to contain. When I didn't answer, she hung up, not in anger or spite, but with the silence of someone who now knew enough, and I lowered the phone slowly, letting my arm fall to my side with the kind of numb weight that told me I had finally reached the end of the version of myself that had always known how to recover. And when I turned back toward the house, I saw Robert in the hallway through the back door, standing at the edge of the stairs with the suitcase now unzipped and open on the bench beside him, methodically placing folded shirts inside without looking at them, like someone handling evidence. He didn't speak when I entered the room, and he didn't look up when I stepped closer, just continued packing with the same careful precision he brought to every part of his life that mattered to him, and the fact that he was still folding. Things meant something deeper than rage ever could, because he wasn't storming out or destroying anything. He was simply removing himself from the space he no longer recognized as home. I stood there silently as he reached for the small wooden box on the dresser, the one we had filled with photos from the first years of our marriage. Not the framed ones we kept out for display, but the real ones, the messy ones. The ones where we were squinting into the sun, or caught mid-laugh, or holding each other with arms wrapped tight like we knew how to do more than pose, and he lifted it gently, almost reverently, like it was the only fragile thing in the room, then placed it into his suitcase with a finality that didn't ask for comment. Still without looking at me, he said in a voice that sounded not tired but depleted, "I won't stay with someone who divided herself into compartments and gave me the part with nothing left in it." And though I wanted to argue, to scream, to plead with him to understand that this hadn't been about division but about survival, the only thing I could do was lower my eyes and nod, because in that moment, he wasn't cruel. He was right. He zipped the suitcase slowly and carefully as if closing a wound with deliberate precision, then reached for the frame on the wall near the stairs, the one with the photo of his parents' anniversary party, and took it down with the same quiet determination, not because he needed it, but because it had always been his, and now he was reclaiming it. And when he turned to walk past me, he didn't touch me or glance at me or say goodbye. He just walked out the door and into the fading light of early evening, the same way he had walked into my life all those years ago, decisive, silent, and certain. I followed him only as far as the front steps, not out of hope or desperation, but because I needed to see for myself that he was really leaving, that this wasn't just another threat or emotional rehearsal, but the real ending we had both ignored for too long. and when I reached the gate, I saw him lifting his suitcase into the trunk of the car with a smooth, practiced motion, the kind that comes when a person has done this before in their mind many times, and when he closed the trunk and turned to get in, our eyes met across the driveway for what felt like the last time. There was no fury in his gaze and no pain either, just a cold acceptance that was somehow sharper than hatred, and for a single moment I wanted him to do something dramatic, or cruel, or loud, something that would shake me and snap me out of this stunned stillness because anything would have been easier to recover from than this unbearable absence of reaction. But instead he got into the car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway without so much as a flicker of hesitation. The neighbors had come out by then, drawn by the sound of the suitcase wheels and the car rolling over the gravel, and the way I stood barefoot on the sidewalk without moving. And I knew they were watching through kitchen windows and porch blinds, knew they were already rehearsing the version of the story they'd retell at dinner, but I didn't care because I couldn't feel my feet or my hands or my mouth anymore. Only the hollow ringing in my ears and the low ache in my chest where something used to live. When the car disappeared down the street and the dust settled, I stayed standing there under the soft gray sky of approaching dusk with my arms hanging useless at my sides and my hair lifting slightly in the breeze like a woman who had just survived something too quiet to name, and the only sound that finally pulled me out of myself was the back door opening behind me, and Sean stepping into the fading light with nothing in his hands and nothing on his face, but the kind of calm that comes from believing you've won something. He didn't approach right away, just waited until I turned slightly, and then he said with a voice softer than I expected, "It's just us now." And while a different version of me might have answered with gratitude or relief or even longing, the only words that came out, flat and final and more honest than anything I'd said in weeks, were, "No, it's not. Now it's just me." The house had never been truly loud even in its most occupied hours, but the kind of silence that settled over it during the 2 weeks that followed was no longer the peaceful stillness of early mornings or the quiet background hum of lives in motion. It was the hollow and unmovable weight of absence that had layered itself into the furniture and the floorboards, and even into the folds of the curtains that no longer danced in the breeze because I hadn't opened the windows since Robert left, and since Sean disappeared without a single spoken word or final glance, and every corner now echoed differently, not with sound but with memory, sharp and uninvited and persistent. Each morning arrived like a mechanical event instead of a passage of time, and my body responded more out of habit than intention. Waking not because of sleep completed, but because somewhere deep in my muscle memory, there still lived the sound of his voice calling from the kitchen at exactly 7:12 a.m., asking if I wanted coffee or cinnamon toast, or simply to come downstairs and sit with him while the light changed on the countertop. And no matter how tightly I wrapped myself in blankets, or how late I stayed up staring at nothing, my eyes opened at that same exact minute every day like a wound too deep to heal had synchronized itself with time. The walls that once held warmth had gone cold in the absence of routine and noise and shared breath, and even though the furniture remained exactly where it had always been, and the pictures on the hallway wall still hung in neat rows, the house no longer felt like mine but like a carefully curated museum of everything I had ruined. And every object whispered accusations not through words, but through the painful familiarity of what once was natural and now was irreversibly gone. My sister, never one to delay consequences once she caught the scent of scandal, had acted quickly, and without hesitation, filing a petition for temporary guardianship over Sean under the pretense of psychological instability due to prolonged inappropriate influence, a phrase that sounded sterile on paper but burned like acid when spoken aloud by the lawyer who called to inform me that I was no longer permitted contact unless it was formally approved and supervised. And though part of me had expected it, had even prepared myself for the backlash, the finality of it landed harder than I imagined because it meant she had stripped away even the illusion of redemption before I had the chance to try. Work, once the one place where I could control perception through performance, fell apart not with confrontation, but with a careful and passive process of erasure, beginning with the email that informed me of an internal review, followed by the series of calendar invitations that were suddenly rescinded without notice, and finally ending with the HR meeting that lasted 17 minutes and ended with a folder of forms and a final handshake that carried no sympathy, just legal closure. And as I walked out of the building that afternoon with my name removed from the staff directory before I even reached the parking lot, I realized reputation didn't die in flames, but in silence, suffocated by the slow collective retreat of every voice that once said my name with admiration. Robert, true to his final gesture, didn't return to confront me or to argue or even to retrieve the last of his belongings. He sent an envelope by courier, addressed in block letters with no return address, and inside was a signed contract for the sale of his share of the house and a single sheet of paper, folded 3 times and written in his usual clean, exact handwriting. And though I unfolded it slowly, hoping for explanation or even accusation, all it said was, "Your mouth is no longer for kisses, only for excuses." And I read it twice before placing it inside the drawer where we used to keep anniversary cards and birthday notes, because even cruelty deserved to be archived when it came from someone who once promised to protect you. And then, without warning, without farewell, without a single word or picture or message, Sean left. There was no note on the pillow or message in the kitchen or footprints on the stairs, only a box left in the hallway wrapped in the same soft gray sweater I used to wear when the heater broke in October. And inside the box was the guitar he had brought with him the day he moved in. The same guitar he had played on the floor beside my feet when the power had gone out that first stormy night. And resting on top of it was a single sheet of notebook, paper with words scribbled in uneven lines that read, "I played it for you, but now you are without an audience." And though it wasn't signed, I didn't need confirmation to know who had written it and what it meant. No closure followed, no update, no digital trace, just a silence so final it felt like the end of a song that had once played in the background of every room and now had vanished mid-note. And even though I told myself I had no right to expect anything more, I still found myself checking my phone during the slow hours between dusk and nightfall, scanning through missed calls and blank screens like some part of me still believed he might reach back and reclaim even a single piece of what he left behind. I no longer counted days the way I used to, not by dates or events or even the things I had to do, but by the repetition of quiet rituals that remained after everything else had gone missing, like the way I still reached for 2 mugs each morning before catching myself mid-motion and setting one back in the cabinet without sound, or how I folded the blanket on the couch every evening even though no one had touched it since the day he left, or how I checked the porch for packages that no longer arrived and stood in doorways trying to remember what my voice used to sound like when I wasn't explaining, apologizing, or asking someone to stay. There were moments, scattered like glass, across the floor of each day, when the ache inside me wasn't loud but constant, a kind of hum just under the skin, and it settled into my bones in ways I hadn't thought grief could. Not sharp or cinematic, but slow and dull and persistent, like a bruise you forget to stop pressing just to see if it still hurts. And though I moved through the house with the deliberate pace of someone determined not to collapse, I knew every room by scent and shadow now, knew which stair creaked second from the top and which light bulb flickered if left on too long, because I had become part of the structure in a way that felt less like belonging and more like haunting. At night, I didn't sleep so much as drift in and out of shallow memory, waking again and again to the echo of laughter that no longer lived in the hallways and the phantom weight of a body that used to fill the other half of my bed. And I learned to lay still in the dark with my eyes open and my hands resting flat on my stomach like a woman preparing for impact, though none ever came because pain, when drawn out like this, does not arrive in moments but in the long, slow absence of comfort. Eventually, the world outside stopped asking questions, stopped whispering and circling and waiting for something dramatic to erupt, and I was left with the ordinary rhythm of a life that had been emptied too quickly to refill, where the neighbors no longer looked twice, and the mailbox no longer held anything but catalogs for things I had no desire to own, and the kitchen, once the center of warmth and noise and shared mornings, became just a place to reheat leftovers in silence, where the fridge hummed like a distant reminder that some machines keep working even when the people who use them do not. The room that had once been his became a kind of museum I didn't admit to visiting, though I found myself there more often than I meant to. Not to remember, but to exist in a space where memory had texture and temperature and scent, because the bedding still carried his shampoo and the closet still held a hoodie I had once worn when it got too cold, and on the windowsill sat the same dried flower he had plucked from the backyard and handed me without explanation on a Tuesday that no longer meant anything. That morning, like all the others before it, began with the same dull stretch of silence and the same reluctant push from sleep into standing. And by the time the sun reached the side wall of the house and cast that pale yellow stripe across the floor, I found myself walking without purpose toward his room, the way someone might reach for a photograph they aren't ready to look at but can't put away. And when I stepped inside, the air smelled like dust and cedar and something faintly citrus that I hadn't noticed before. And I stood in the center of the room without touching anything until the weight of it all pressed into my ribs and I finally moved toward the bed. The blanket, soft and slightly rumpled from the last time I had clutched it in the dark, still lay folded across the foot of the mattress, and I lifted it slowly, not reverently, but carefully, The way you hold something you aren't sure is still yours. And as I sat down with it bunched in my arms, I felt the full weight of what I had lost settle into my chest, not as panic or despair, but as the kind of deep and mournful acceptance that does not scream or break, but simply rests. And I brought the fabric to my face and inhaled the scent that still lingered there, closing my eyes not to cry but to remember what it had once felt like to be chosen in the dark. I didn't speak, and I didn't move, and I didn't pretend. I just sat there with my legs folded beneath me and my arms wrapped around the old blanket like it was a body that could still return my warmth. And for the first time since the night Robert walked out and the day Sean disappeared, I allowed myself the full and total silence of a woman no longer waiting for anything, because I knew then that what remained wasn't hope or anger or even guilt. It was just the shape of a life that no longer belonged to anyone but me. I had given him the blanket, then the pillow, then my mornings, my evenings, my rhythm, my breath, my pauses, and every quiet version of myself I had once hidden from the world, and in the end, there was only one thing he did not take. He did not take my name.